Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out a complete guide on how to play Guardian Druid in patch 8.2, including going over all the new stuff that was added in the patch. I'll start out this video by quickly covering the buffs that happen to bears, then move on to the pros and cons of the class, how to play spec and gear, and finally finish up with 8.2's new Essence system. If you already have a good handle on the class and just need a refresher, there will be a table of contents in the video description so that you can quickly skip to the section you're looking for. So without going into way too much detail, here are the changes to Bear. Rage has been buffed a lot, like a whole bunch. As a result, Bear feels immensely easier and more satisfying to play. Thrash and Mangle both had their direct damage increased by roughly 15%. This has helped improve Bear Druid's damage from previously being the lowest of the tanks by far to being reasonably competitive for the tanks at the lower end of the spectrum. Frenzied Regen heals for a decent chunk more, which is fine. And lastly, you can dispel poisons and curses without having to shift out of bear form. This is a really nice change for Mythic Plus, and it even adds more utility to a class that's already overflowing with utility. And on that note, let's move into what's good about Bear Druids. They have a lot of utility. They are the only tank that can remove curses, and now they can do it in bear form. They have Ursol's Vortex, they have Typhoon, they have Incapacitating Roar. That's 3 basic AoE CCs that don't put stuns on the diminishing return. They can battle res, they have a group mobility skill, they can even provide shockingly good bursts of group healing if they're spec'd in a restoration affinity. All of this utility is really nice to have in Mythic Plus. In raids, it's not bad, but someone else can usually do whatever it is that you're trying to do with a bear. Meh. Bears also have pretty decent active mitigation. While Iron Fur may not be quite as good at total mitigation as a Warrior's Shield block, or a Pali's Shield of the Righteous, or as versatile as a Monk's Stagger, it's very, very dependable, and it does reduce your damage taken by a serious amount. As a result, bears are pretty good at staying alive in raid, and that's a good thing. And with that, let's jump to the cons. The number one complaint among Bear Druids about the class is that Frenzied Regeneration is on the GCD. It already has a long cooldown and a non-trivial rage cost. Should it also be on the GCD? No. No, it should not. Second, and somewhat less important, Bear Druid's damage output has been pretty awful all expansion long. The buffs helped in Mythic Plus, and on fights like Orgazoa, but the buffs were fairly conservative, and bears are still one of the lowest damage tanks in single target. And since Eternal Palace is a single target heavy raid, you get it. I had expected Druid to jump up ahead of DK and Monk on DPS because of the buffs, but that didn't really happen on account of the encounter design. It's not the end of the world. Bear damage is much better than it was. It's a close 6th place. Yikes. Again, they deal respectable damage in Mythic Plus and the 2 add heavy fights in Eternal Palace, so that is a pretty big silver lining. And lastly, Druid's kinda slow. I mean that both in the literal sense that they don't have a lot of mobility tools, and in the sense that they have a simple offensive rotation. For me, that's not really a con. I enjoy the class's simple offense in Mythic Plus, specifically because it lets me focus more on the massive volume of utility skills they have. But I understand why some players might find Bear Druid's offense to be a little underwhelming. All in all, I think I like bears more than I think I should. They seem like the most defensively oriented of all the tanks, but for whatever reason, when I start playing one in Mythic Plus, I just really have a good time enjoying all of the utility they have, the very simple but effective way that they deal AoE damage. It's a class that's more fun than it looks like it would be at first glance. So now let's quickly go over talents. Here's a one-size-fits almost all talent setup. In the first tier, you arguably have 3 usable options. I prefer Brambles in most situations because it provides direct damage output and damage reduction, and it's the best DPS option in the tier, especially in single target. It also turns Barkskin into a very minor AoE DPS cooldown, so that's something. The other two talents generate rage. Blood Frenzy is better in AoE, and Bristling Fur is better against hard-hitting single-target mobs. Basically, you can always take Brambles in single target. You could use Bristling Fur in super tough single-target raid fights, but Brambles will usually get the job done and do it better. Blood Frenzy can increase your damage reduction in AoE by more if you're willing to really focus on putting up a lot of stacks of Iron Fur. It's not quite as popular as Brambles in Mythic Plus, or as good for DPS, but it has a higher defensive ceiling. It's safer. It also allows you to just spam Thrash and Swipe in AoE without really ever having to mangle to generate enough rage to maintain Iron Fur, and that makes it pretty easy to use effectively in Mythic dungeons too. Tier 2 also has 3 potentially usable options, although Tiger Dash is really only useful in spots where you aren't actively tanking and need to move quickly. Those are pretty rare. Wild Charge is a more generally useful mobility skill, and pretty much the only personal mobility skill you'll have in bear form. Ursol's Vortex is really powerful for kiting adds or bringing mobs together quickly. It's also great for helping split emissaries away from other mobs. I prefer the utility of Ursol's Vortex for Mythic Plus, especially if you were to be up against a horrible affix combo like Fortified Teeming Necrotic. Tier 3 has 3 great choices. In Mythic Plus, I really like the healing utility offered by Restoration Affinity. It's not mandatory, but being able to throw out some extra heals while your healer is drinking can help runs move along smoothly. In raids, I would say it's probably the weakest of the 3 once you feel comfortable on fights, but for the very beginning of progression, it is usually the option that people will take because it provides the most defensive value, and that's fine. The extra 3-yard range from Balance Affinity is nice for picking up adds in Raid and Mythic Plus, and will increase your AoE DPS a little bit. And finally, the movement speed increase from Feral Affinity is extremely nice for any time in Raid when you have to move around a lot. In Tier 4, Typhoon is usually the most useful option. AoE stuns are pretty common, AoE knockbacks aren't. I guess AoE roots aren't either, but they're not usually as useful. Typhoon fills a vaguely similar role to Ursol's Vortex, particularly in Mythic Plus when it comes to separating emissaries from their groups, but there's really nothing wrong with having 2 useful AoE CCs. Yeah. In Tier 5, Galactic Guardian is basically always the best option. Soul of the Forest could theoretically be better on patchwork fights, but that hasn't proven to be true at all in Eternal Palace thus far. Galactic Guardian is better in virtually all practical applications, and it adds some fun depth to the rotation as well. Incarnation, Guardian of Versok, is an interesting offensive cooldown, but the cooldown for it is too long for it to be competitive in Raid or Mythic Plus. It has become slightly more popular in Season 3 than it had been thus far this expansion, but it's definitely still not really good enough to be a competitor. The uptime is just way too low. The 6th tier is another set it and forget it kind of tier. Guardian of Elune and Earthwarden do basically the same thing. Both talents compete to provide extra damage reduction. Earthwarden just does it much better. Survival of the Fittest is very useful if you really need access to extra defensive cooldowns, which can be really nice in Raid. Because Eternal Palace has a lot of taunt swap boss fights, it's pretty easy to taunt with 3 stacks of Earthwarden already ready to go. And that's a nice little defensive bump that can help smooth out your damage taken over the course of a fight. And the last tier is another one-choice tier. Rend and Tear outperforms the competition by a huge margin. It's easier to use, better for DPS, and provides better AoE defense than Pulverize. Pulverize is theoretically better in single target in terms of defense, but in practical applications the difference is close enough to just simply not matter. Lunar Beam is pretty, but it's also bad, so it's really not even worth mentioning. Oh, whoops. Alright, time to get down to the nuts and bolts of how to play the class. Bear is really simple and pretty forgiving when it comes to the basic ability priority. The class does technically have different rotations based on how many targets you're tanking at once, but the most important things to do are to try and use Thrash and Mangle as much as possible when you're tanking 1 to 3 targets, and keep Moonfire active all of the time. If you're tanking anything more than 3 targets, it gets significantly easier. Just try to Thrash on cooldown and swipe as much as you can. Maintaining Moonfire on a priority target is good, and if you need to cast Mangle or Moonfire to generate rage so that you can maintain Iron Fur, that's absolutely worth doing. Otherwise, you can usually just get away with thrashing, swiping, and auto-attacking. If you're running Blood Frenzy instead of Brambles, you definitely won't need to Mangle or Moonfire to have enough rage to Iron Fur in AoE. If you are trying to kill a priority target, Mangle and Moonfire are still going to do more damage to it than a swipe, but it is a net DPS loss in terms of your total AoE damage. I suppose it's also worth mentioning that Maul is the Bear Druid offensive rage dump. It's on the global cooldown, and while it deals a decent amount of single target damage, it's a little bit of a bummer to spend rage to deal pure single target damage. As a result, you should generally try to use it when you're not actively tanking or the content isn't all that hard hitting. For the handful of irritating caster mobs or bosses in Mythic Plus, such as the third boss in the Motherlode or Shadow of Zul, the trash mob / hardest hitting boss in the entire game in King's Rest, you basically just want to maul all of your rage away instead of using Iron Fur, and try desperately to keep yourself alive with a combination of frenzied regen, defensive cooldowns, and yelling at your healer. I really hate caster mobs. In terms of defenses, if you're maintaining Iron Fur, you're basically doing it right. You can try to stack it up a few times if you expect to take a lot of damage, but there are pretty heavy diminishing returns with that. As a result, you should try to typically layer out your Iron Fur casts rather than just burning through your rage as quickly as you generate it. Frenzied Regeneration is a simple heal. It returns around a third of your total health over 3 seconds. That's about it. In terms of cooldowns, Druid has a fairly limited but effective toolkit. Bark Skin is your basic defensive cooldown. It's not huge, but it's a decent first line of defense. Survival Instincts is the big shield wall. It's very strong and has 2 charges, but the duration is fairly short, so you will need to be precise. That's it. Now let's move on to gearing. Here's the secondary stat priority for Bear Druids. Ordinarily, this is the part where I would say that item level is the most important aspect of gearing for Bear Druids, and that is very true, but I think it's really important to emphasize that secondary stats for bears are all incredibly close in value. Use the Simcraft add-on in raidbots.com to sim yourself. Do it! Item level is king for everything except trinkets and rings. You should try to wear rings that give you as much haste on them as possible, but again, the difference between secondary stats for Bear Druids is small, so sim yourself. Sockets are worth 5 to 10 item levels on regular pieces of armor, and quite a lot more on rings, so bear that in mind. Now while we're on the subject of gear, let's move on to Azerite traits. Rather than cover all of the traits Druids have available, let me go over the really good ones and offer up a blanket statement that the rest of them aren't all that special. The first, and arguably best defensive Azerite trait for Druids, is Layered Mane. It's very simple. Iron Fur grants you agility, and you get a 10% chance to get a free extra stack. Extra damage mitigation is never a bad thing. This trait is good, at least for 1 point. It doesn't really change anything mechanically, so it's not absolutely mandatory, but it's nice. Next is Twisted Claws. Again, this trait doesn't do anything special in terms of mechanics, but it does grant a serious chunk of agility, more than you get from Layered Mane. Agility is good. This trait is absolutely worth stacking up to 3 ranks. That's almost it for good bear traits. It's kind of amazing how unremarkable all of Bear's traits are, but there are 3 others that I think deserve an additional mention just because of how they work. Burst of Savagery provides a large but short mastery buff. The chance for Mangle to reactivate Gore is very nice in single target, but the fact that you have to actually consume the Gore proc by casting Mangle to get the mastery buff means that this trait is a little bit of a bummer in large scale AoE. Again, 1 point is all you need. Next up is Guardian's Wrath. which is the best single target damage trait for bears. It reduces the defensive opportunity cost of casting Maul by 15 rage, and tacks on a decent little chunk of extra damage. 1 point is all you need, and this bonus is purely dedicated to maximizing your single target damage, which means it's really only useful in raids. If you are using this trait, you'll want to cast Maul pretty frequently. Don't let Iron Fur fall off while you're tanking, but do keep mauling regularly to max that damage. And lastly, here's Wild Flesh Rending. It's kind of the AoE equivalent of Guardian's Wrath. It's a cat trait that's way better for bear. This trait is a pure DPS increase with 0 defensive benefit, so it's probably not worth wearing for most of the fights in Eternal Palace, but it's extremely powerful in AoE, and thus, Mythic Dungeons. Late in Season 2, many bears were running 3 ranks of Wild Flesh Rending and 3 ranks of Twisted Claws in Mythic Plus, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that's how it winds up turning out again, but at least for now there's nothing wrong with erring on the side of caution and grabbing 1 point in Layered Main. In the second ring there are a few decent defensive traits and some good stat traits, but Heed My Call and Gut Ripper are generally the best traits for dealing damage. And finally, in the inner ring, there are really only 2 traits that are particularly good. Gemhide is still a decent boost to your damage reduction through armor, which is great, and Impassive Visage is a really versatile, reliable trickle of self-healing. Neither is crucial, but they are both nice if you can get them. Now let's move on to trinkets. First off, the Diamond Lace Refracting Prism from Opulence in Battle of Dazar'alor is still by far the best defense first trinket in BFA for its item level. Its Absorb Shield scales with haste and versatility. Now the thing to remember when wearing defensive trinkets is that you can't kill a boss by reducing its damage, so unless you're tanking something that really threatens to kill you, you probably should just wear something that provides extra damage instead. If you do need that defense though, this trinket rules. It's still one of the most popular trinkets for Druids in the game, and that's true in both Raid and Mythic Plus, although it's definitely a better option for Mythic Plus at this point. I put out a video covering all the trinkets available to tanks in the new raid a couple of weeks ago, so check that out if you're interested. In terms of dealing extra damage, there are plenty of good trinkets available in Mythic Plus as well. The best trinkets for Mythic Plus are Harlan's Loaded Dice from Freehold and Deadeye Spyglass from Siege of Borealis. Any stat proc trinkets will work nicely, and most damage proc trinkets are pretty competitive. The Alchemy trinket is also really decent. And now finally, it's time for essences, so let's just jump directly into breaking them down. Let's start with the very first trait you get from this system, the Crucible of Flame. It's an extremely basic power, it deals increasing damage or healing to a single target. That's it. It's basic, but it's also the highest performing essence in single target, which means it's usually the best option in raid. It's easy to use, and super powerful. There's not a lot else to say. It is good. Let's move on. Now on to another basic essence, World Vein Resonance. This essence basically gives you extra agility, and all you have to do is stay within range of a thing on the ground. As a major power, it's bad. The minor power, on the other hand, provides a ton of agility in raids if other players are also using it, so think about taking it as a minor, just don't use the major. Ripple in Space is a weird delayed teleport that deals damage. Absolutely not. Negative yes. Extra no. Memory of Lucid Dreams grants you extra rage generation, and the minor is a 15% chance to return half of any rage you spend. Unlike warriors, who can very efficiently convert rage into damage or damage reduction with no cooldown, druids have a lot tougher time spending rage efficiently. You can spam Iron Fur, but that has heavy diminishing returns, and using this essence to spam Maul isn't better than just using Crucible of Flames. As a result, this doesn't really have the same appeal. The minor power is not bad. It's a decent, always helpful option that can definitely help you cast more Mauls and Iron Furs throughout a boss fight, or throughout a dungeon. There are better alternatives out there at times, but again, it's always pretty good. Next up is Vision of Perfection, which is weird and bad for bears. The major power grants you a short proc of Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc, even if you're not talented into it, and you shouldn't be, but it reduces the cooldown of Survival Instincts. Yeah, the major power isn't worth taking in any situation, but the minor synergizes pretty nicely with survival of the fittest. If you really need the extra survival instincts uses during a raid fight, pick this up, but only as a minor power. Conflict and Strife is the last of the role-agnostic Azerite Essences, and it comes from rated PvP. For Bear Druids, it grants Sharpened Claws, which has the potential to be an enormous boost to your AoE damage. Actively maintaining the buff requires sacrificing a lot of defense, so this essence probably won't ever be tremendously popular, but there is some potential synergy with Guardian's Wrath that could make this an interesting choice for max AoE damage. As I understand it, you need at least 25% haste to fit enough thrashes and swipes into each maul window in order for Sharpened Claws to have a chance of outperforming Anima of Life and Death. And even if you have that much haste, it's not necessarily better, and considerably more complicated to use. The minor power is just a great big stacking versatility buff, which is totally awesome. Now onto the tank-specific essences. Azeroth's Undying Gift is a very simple defensive cooldown. It comes from the new Eternal Palace raid. This power is very nice and fits into Bear's toolkit smoothly. If you find yourself needing another defensive cooldown for raid, this is the best one offered by Essence Powers. Anima of Life and Death is a very interesting option for bears and looks to be the safest and most reliable choice for dealing AoE damage, and it's definitely the most popular option in Mythic Plus for good reason. It's a pretty long cooldown for an AoE damage skill, and it maybe doesn't have quite the high potential for increasing your DPS over the course of a fight as Conflict and Strife, but it's way more consistent and much safer. The healing and max health it provides are also pretty nice. I like this power a lot. It's already become the de facto choice for Mythic Plus bears, and I don't think that's going to change. Next up is Aegis of the Deep, which is not a good essence. Flat damage reduction is not great in general. Bear Druids are probably in the best circumstances of any of the 6 tanks to maximize the value of this essence, and it still only stands to be a 15 to 30% damage reduction cooldown under normal circumstances. And it's on the global cooldown. It's just bad. The minor power provides a very large chunk of versatility when tanking large groups of mobs, so that could wind up being very good in Mythic Plus. Nullification Dynamo has a very nice minor power, arguably the best minor power for most fights in Eternal Palace. If you need magic damage mitigation, it is the best minor power available, no question, and it provides a nice chunk of damage too. It's even pretty good in magic damage heavy mythic dungeons such as Shrine of the Storm. The major power, on the other hand, totally sucks. It's undertuned, the cooldown is super long, and it's on the global cooldown. It's just doing way too little, as badly as it possibly can. And finally, here's Sphere of Suppression. The minor power grants a reactive slow and a small boost to haste and movement speed, which is pretty nice. The major power's 25% attack speed slow can be a really powerful defensive cooldown in Mythic Plus. This potentially provides a really strong kiting cooldown for Druids, filling one of the bigger holes in the class's toolkit. All in all, I would be shocked if some Druids don't wind up using this to push higher level Mythic Plus, but it doesn't have the same direct offensive appeal of Anima of Life and Death. I see this being a safer choice for brutal affix combos like Teeming Necrotic Fortified, but I doubt players will use this outside of those kind of terrifying Mythic Plus weeks. So just to recap, for major powers, Crucible of Flames is the best single target damage power. Anima of Life and Death is the safest, strongest, most reliable, and most popular essence in Mythic Plus and AoE fights. Azeroth's Undying Gift is the best defensive major power for raids, and Sphere of Suppression looks like the best defensive major power for Mythic Plus. As for minor powers, Nullification Dynamo is an A+ in raids and pretty good in Mythic Plus. World Vein Resonance is good in raids and bad in Mythic Plus. Memory of Lucid Dreams and Conflict and Strife are both good in raids in Mythic Plus. And Aegis of the Deep and Sphere of Suppression are both good in Mythic Plus, but not great in raids. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Bear Druid, ask away. Stay tuned for more patch 8.2 content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.